Alert! We're on the verge of everything breaking. Hey guys, Britt here. Welcome to End Times Bible Prophecy. Already we're seeing major issues in global credit markets. But now, given the US government shutdown, we're seeing major stress in the banking system. Are we on the verge of seeing bank runs? In short, I believe the answer is yes. If we see the government shutdown persist, the likelihood of bank runs increases with each passing day. So in today's video, we're going to talk about what's going on and where all of this is headed. But first, in case you missed it yesterday, over on the Substack at brittgillette.substack.com, I put out this article, The New Church of AI, and I put new in quotations because there's nothing new about this. It's really idolatry is all it is. The coming worship of artificial intelligence, and really that could be, well, just the worship of artificial intelligence because we're already seeing this. But this goes through what we're seeing right now, where there are groups of people who are involved and engaged in the worship of artificial intelligence. And we talk about where all of this leads and why there's really nothing new about it. It's just modern day idolatry. So make sure to check that out over at the Substack. Also, we have the live Q&A with Britt and Jenny is later tonight at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. The Sunday article that went out is America Under Financial Attack. You will find the link to that live Q&A at the bottom of that article. So if you want to join us live tonight, you can ask any question you want. We'll do our best to answer those questions, but the link is at the bottom of this article right there. If you are unable to make the live session, but you still have a question, just leave a comment at the bottom of one of these articles on the Substack, either today's video or Monday's video or this article from Sunday or Tuesday. I'll review all of those. I'll pull the questions from that. Just call it out, put question in big caps so that it stands out. But I'll read all the comments and try to capture all of those prior to the live Q&A at 7 p.m. So just leave your questions there and we'll do our best to answer that. So we hope to see you all later tonight at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for the monthly live Q&A. So why are we on the verge of seeing everything break? Well, let's just start with this. We've seen all of these credit problems emerging over the past couple of months. We saw First Brands enter bankruptcy, and this has caused major problems with a number of banks that were owed cash from First Brands. This was a big scandal. There's a lot of fraud that has taken place. We see the same thing with a lender called Tricolor. So you've probably seen these in the news media. And of course, they aren't the only ones. So we read here in U.S. News and World Report, it says First Brands Tricolor collapses raise fears of credit stress with Jamie Dimon. So Jamie Dimon is the head of J.P. Morgan, the largest bank in the world, largest private bank anyway, warning of, quote, more cockroaches. So what he's saying is where there's not just one cockroach usually. You may see one, but that means that there are others that are hidden. And so we're likely to see other credit problems, other issues like First Brand and Tricolors, and that's exactly what we're seeing. We had this from Zero Hedge about breathtaking fraud. BlackRock ripped off for $500 million, and the curious case of Bankim Brombat. So this is a man that basically defrauded BlackRock out of $500 million. So we're seeing many of these problems cropping up, credit issues. This is what happens when you have the Federal Reserve bailing out all these institutions, artificially lowering interest rates for the last 15 plus years, if not much longer than that. And it creates this something called moral hazard, where these banks are willing to, all of these institutions really are willing to take risk that under normal conditions they would not take. But they know, well, we can take these risks and reap the rewards, and if it all goes wrong, well, the government will come along and bail us out. And so it creates these conditions where people are loaning out, these institutions are loaning out millions and billions of dollars without doing their due diligence. And they're being defrauded, and we're seeing these problems come to the surface. But guys, that is only just the tip of the iceberg of what we're seeing, because the big problems we're seeing right now in the banking system are a direct result of the current U.S. government shutdown. So let's take a look at this right here. So this is from the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. This is the Treasury General Account. You'll hear this referred to in the media as the TGA in the financial media. What is this? Well, essentially it's the U.S. government's checking account. That's the best way to think about it. They write checks off of this to pay contractors for government spending. Government spending is supposed to be going through this account. But we know there's a whole bunch of fraud at the federal level as well. But anyway, we see this steeply rising to the point that right now there's just close to $1 trillion in this account. Now, under normal circumstances, this wouldn't necessarily be anything to be alarmed about, but keep in mind, this represents payments that are building up that need to go out to contractors, employees, out into the economy, and that is not happening right now under this shutdown. And right now, the banking system is in a very fragile state, stressed for liquidity. What is liquidity? Well, liquidity means the banks need cash to pay short-term obligations, but getting that cash is very hard to come by. So for instance, this is different from being, bankrupt, because for instance, you pretend you have a high net worth of $10 million. You own 10 $1 million houses, but your bank account has $12 in it. And you have to pay some bills, right? You have some utilities and groceries and other things that you have to pay for. You have a liquidity crisis. You lack the cash, even though you have a high net worth. And so that's what the banking industry is facing right now, is the banking system is facing a liquidity crisis, a lack of cash, a lack of dollars. And the longer this shutdown goes on, the higher this amount goes up. And it's starving the system of those, what would be deposits into the banking system. As these contractors are paid, as employers are paid, they would place these funds into the bank and then go pay their bills, and paying their bills, it's going to another bank account and so forth, but it would go into the system. You might say, well, okay, they don't have this cash coming into the system, but why can't they raise cash by other means? So for instance, they could sell some bonds, right? We had this tweet here from Spencer Hakamanian. He says, U.S. banks are now sitting on $395 billion in unrealized losses. So we've looked at this chart a number of times over the last several years. And certainly they're better off now than they were back here, where we're looking at $700 billion in unrealized losses. But look at how this compares to the Great Financial Crisis. This little tiny blip back here was the Great Financial Crisis. This is where the U.S. banking system stands today. And again, we've pointed out these are unrealized losses as long as they don't become realized. Well, the banks can't sell these at current market rates without realizing those losses. So therefore, the government bonds that the banking system is sitting on are not a source of liquidity. They cannot sell these in the open market and raise the cash they need. Well, how about other things like this? So we had this from Peak Financial Investing. They asked, who exactly is sitting on all of these losses? Who's holding the bag? And here we have a chart showing the delinquency rate of office commercial mortgage-backed securities. So this is for office space, office buildings. And we see this delinquency rate that far exceeds what we saw at the worst moments of the great financial crisis. And you go, well, who's holding this? Well, the short answer is the regional banks are holding this. Not the big banks so much, not the small community banks, but the regional banks. And Florida Atlantic University has done a number of studies on this. We've looked at some of those and who some of those banks are. There's 1,800 banks that have exposure to commercial real estate that bank regulators say puts them at an excess capacity to go bankrupt, basically. Like it puts these banks in trouble, and yet they've been extending, they've been pretending, they've been hoping that these loans will somehow be paid back. We know that they won't, but they certainly, in the meantime, can't sell these loans to other institutions. If a bank, one of these regional banks needs cash, they can't turn around and say, well, we'll sell some of these loans to, say, JP Morgan and we'll raise the cash. Because no one's going to buy these underperforming loans, not for what they're worth. So you will book a loss if you sell those. Well, what about some of the cash they have on hand? Well, as we've pointed out before, most people are completely unaware of this, but this is from the Federal Reserve, its own website. It says, as announced on March 15th, 2020, the board reduced reserve requirement ratios to 0%. That's a zero. You heard that correctly. 0% effective March 26th, 2020. This action eliminated reserve requirements for all depository institutions. In other words, banks are not required to hold any cash on hand to meet withdrawals. And so you can see why perhaps we see a liquidity crisis today in the banking system for all of these different reasons. And we're seeing that liquidity crisis rise to the surface in recent days. So we have this here. This is a tweet from last Thursday from the great Martis. He says, ladies and gentlemen, I present to you another $5 billion Federal Reserve pump into the banking system. The self-correcting facility reveals real-time cracks in the banking system and has now become a daily fixture, undeniably exposing issues within the banking sector. The use of the facility is now a daily occurrence. The regional banking sector obviously has a liquidity issue. That's a total of $40 billion since June. And what he's talking about here is use of the standing repo facility with the Federal Reserve. We'll talk about what that is in just a second, but this has gotten much worse since Thursday. So especially on Friday, we can see how this jumped up. Let's look at this chart over time, and we can see this was the COVID crisis back here. This was the lead up to the great financial crisis. This was the COVID crisis. We're seeing this now spike up. This was Friday. So this is a sign of stress within the banking system. So this is a program that the Federal Reserve operates whereby they will receive U.S. treasuries from banks and in turn lend those banks cash. And this happens generally on an overnight basis. This occurs on a daily basis. But seeing this tick up like this is a sign of major stress within the banking system. And again, this is being exacerbated to a high degree by the current U.S. government shutdown. So I want to turn your attention to this right here. So this is an article written by Just Dario. You can read his work on X, formerly known as Twitter. I highly recommend that. He has a lot of fantastic insights, but this is located at justdario.com. And he put together this article back on September 30th. So this isn't something written yesterday that's making bold, hyperbolic claims. No, this was something that last month, well over a month ago, 5 weeks ago, he said, look out for this, and now we are seeing it. But he says no one will care about a U.S. government shutdown unless it sparks a bank run. He says the United States is teetering on the edge of its 22nd federal government shutdown since 1976. While markets are dismissive, assuming, as in the past, that, quote, nothing is going to happen, this is more than just domestic political theater. If not resolved quickly, this shutdown could become a severe stress test for a global financial system already riddled with liquidity issues, a theme I highlighted 3 months ago in the article Liquidity Cracks Widen in the Global Financial House of Cards. And we've pointed out it's exactly what it is. The global financial system is a house of cards. It's a Ponzi scheme on a house of cards built on a foundation of lies, and it's going to come toppling down. He says objectively, the risk of a U.S. debt default is low. The U.S. Treasury General Account, the TGA, we looked at that a moment ago, almost $1 trillion, is flush with $786 billion. Again, this was published back on September 30th. It's now close to $1 trillion, bolstered by recent quarterly tax inflows. However, prolonged political uncertainty could spark serious trouble in the plumbing of the global financial system. Markets have weathered 21 prior shutdowns, totaling approximately 170 days since 1976, typically treating them as transient noise. The U.S. Treasury also has a well-established toolkit to mitigate fallout. It prioritizes critical payments to avoid a default, and if it nears the debt limit, it can employ extraordinary measures. Interest payments on the U.S. debt remain the absolute top priority. Failure here would trigger a technical default and a global financial Armageddon. I don't think he expects that. I don't expect that. But that doesn't mean that it's all roses. He says the risk lies not in the shutdown itself, but in its duration intersecting with an already fragile liquidity backdrop. And he goes through these different scenarios of a 7-day shutdown, a shutdown beyond 2 weeks. Well, those have already passed. And he mentions if this occurs at 35 days or longer. Well, today marks the 35th day. As of midnight, it will be 35 days since the U.S. federal government shut down. So with each passing day, what he writes here is going to become worse. So he says a 35-day saga, matching the 2018-19 record, could spell serious trouble. It would idle 2 million workers and delay hundreds of billions in contracts at a time of high inflation, while half the population lives paycheck to paycheck. If consumer insolvencies skyrocket and people start draining deposits, problems could escalate rapidly for banks already saddled with a mountain of increasingly radioactive, illiquid assets. We just talked about what some of those are. $395 billion in unrealized losses on government bonds alone. Commercial real estate losses that are astronomical. And he says that next, especially commercial real estate loans, which they cannot sell for liquidity without booking steep losses. So again, this is what we've been talking about for years. These unrealized losses the banks are sitting on, they're not a problem. They're unrealized until they are. And if people start going to the banks and saying, I want to take my cash out, they have to sell these things at a loss. And you're going to see bank failures and you're going to see bank runs. He says, imagine a shutdown dragging past 35 days. And we don't have to imagine at this point. We're at day 35 as of now. A political standoff could accidentally trigger a liquidity crisis event that can quickly morph into a bank run, similar to the one that took down Silicon Valley Bank, First Republic, and Credit Suisse in 2023. The system's reserves are the lifeblood of money markets. Normally, the Treasury General Account acts as a cash buffer. But during a shutdown, the government draws down the TGA only to meet critical payments, which increases TGA balances and effectively siphons reserves from the banking system. As you can observe in the chart, banks' reserve balances have been decreasing rapidly since July, and are currently not far from the lows of 2023 when the U.S. regional bank crisis sparked. And again, this was written back on September 30th. Here is that chart today and where we are. And we are just a few, 12 million? Wait, it's very close to the lows of 2023. Before we saw that crisis. This goes on. He says, in a prolonged shutdown, this reserves drawdown becomes sustained. The system loses its margin of safety. Even if aggregate reserves seem sufficient, they become unevenly distributed, meaning some banks have adequate reserves, others do not. Some banks, especially those active in trading, find their usable cash positions strained. He says this is where the repo market, the core plumbing connecting cash and collateral, begins to fail. And that's what we just looked at over here. We're seeing this. Entities needing short-term funding compete for a shrinking pool of cash. If cash tightens, the repo rate spikes. Lenders hoard cash, raising funding cost further. We saw this in September 2019 when repo rates exploded from 2.5% to over 10%, forcing the Fed to intervene and quickly inject $250 billion into the money market system. And guys, I would add, there were actually trillions that we found out later were injected into the banking system in the fall of 2019 in the fourth quarter. And this just happened to coincide with the arrival of something in 2020 that gave the Federal Reserve and central banks around the world the excuse to print trillions in cash. 40% of all the US dollars in existence were created between February 2020 and February 2022. And I would argue that all of that came as a result of covering this up, which we'll get at to in a moment. What could this be? What are we going to see next? He says in a 35-day or longer shutdown, these stresses would unfold on a broader scale. As repo markets tighten, banks will have to liquidate assets or hoard cash, exacerbating price dislocations. Simultaneously, they face stress from the deposit side. Job losses and uncertainty cause households and businesses to draw down deposits. So many people that are working for the government, they aren't getting paid right now. They're having to pay all of their bills just the same, so their accounts are drawing down. At some point, this stress shifts from a financial system plumbing problem to a classic bank run. Confidence erodes, depositors rush to move cash, and banks fire sell assets, pushing down valuations and further tightening liquidity. The system, interconnected through exposures, begins to seize. At this moment, the Federal Reserve would be forced to step in, not as a minor adjuster, but as the plumbing's ultimate backstop. It would likely reintroduce large-scale repo operations, expand lending facilities, potentially restart large-scale treasury purchases to rebuild reserves, and even consider unconventional interventions like the Bank Term Funding Program facility used in 2023 to effectively inject temporary capital into struggling banks without congressional approval. And guys, in other words, they're just going to print and do everything they can to bail out the system. He says, in conclusion, I recognize that rising markets are a primary concern for politicians. However, during a shutdown, the president cannot simply eliminate what bothers stocks, as he consistently did so far, to the point that there's a new term for it, taco. For those that don't know, it's Trump always chickens out. So we saw this back in April with all of the market was collapsing due to all these trade wars and the announced tariffs. And then Trump pulled back on everything and the markets rallied. Well, he's saying here, there's nothing Trump can do. He says, currently one political side benefits from the status quo while the other seeks a political victory and to regain consensus ahead of next year's midterm elections in the U.S. The second party, though, must be careful not to be blamed for triggering a non-temporary economic crisis, or worse, a global financial crisis. In the coming days, vigilance is key. The question is not if a shutdown will cause a U.S. default. It almost certainly won't. The real danger is that a lengthy political standoff, keeping the federal government operations shut, triggers a banking crisis that combines the 2019 repo shock with 2023's poor asset liquidity crisis. So what does that all mean? We'll look at that in just a second, but keep in mind, this is something global in nature. So we had this from the Sri Lanka Guardian. It says, Reserve Bank of India holds emergency talks as bond yields spike. The Reserve Bank of India meets banks and primary dealers amid liquidity concerns and a sharp rise in government bond yields. This occurred yesterday. So guys, this is a global problem. And again, we talked about this. We've been talking about this for quite some time. But I put out this article in August of last year. So at this point, this is, 15 months old. It's titled, How the Current Global Financial Crisis Leads to Biblical Tyranny in 10 Steps. It says, when the system breaks, the solution will be conveniently waiting in the wings. And we go through what those steps are. And step 3 is limited bank runs. And here we talk about those unrealized losses and the problems that are faced. And in the Just Dario article, he mentioned, well, if all of this happens, then we would expect the Federal Reserve to step in and print, do everything it can to bail out the system. That's what we have here. Step 4, a massive government central bank response. They're going to do everything they can to hold it up. The question is, do we see something similar to 2023, where the Bank Term Funding Program was able to patch over the problem, kick the can down the road for another day, or will they lose control of it? And if you remember, Janet Yellen testified before Congress. She said, we thought we were on the verge of seeing a global bank run. But at the time, she told everybody, the fundamentals of the banking system are sound. Everything's great. That's what she told Congress. They never brought her up on perjury charges when she went before Congress a year later and said, I'm glad we escaped that. I will never forget we were on the verge of a global bank run. So guys, they're going to lie to you when all of this is unfolding. Remember that. Or do we see this quickly accelerate through these additional steps, including a bank bail-in and then just something big blowing up? There's $1 to $4 quadrillion of derivatives in the global market. Nobody understands it. It's so complex. Warren Buffett called these weapons of financial mass destruction, and we don't know what may blow up and start a cascading contagion effect through the banking system that ultimately leads to the credit market freezing and a bank holiday being instituted. And as we've mentioned before, this does not mean everybody gets the day off and you grill some steaks in the backyard or some hot dogs and hamburgers. No, a bank holiday means all the banking system, the whole financial system shuts down while they try to figure out how to reopen it and have it continue to work. So you need to be prepared for that. You need to have a deep pantry for that. You need to make yourself as resilient as possible. But right after that, well, that next step is to roll out the new system. Central bank digital currency, tokenized assets, digital IDs. And guys, once they do that, the world is in a system that is indistinguishable in capability and function from the mark of the beast system. They will be able to turn off your ability to buy or sell like a light switch and kick you out of society, essentially. So there are dire consequences on the other end for a financial meltdown of the magnitude that we're talking about here. Are we about to see it? And I would argue, well, is the government shutdown intended to bring this outcome? Because then they could blame something that's going to happen anyway, that's inevitable anyway, on the government shutdown. Oh, well, if it hadn't been for that government shutdown, all this wouldn't have happened. Trump can say it's the Democrats' fault, and the Democrats can say, well, it was Trump was in charge when this happened. And they can argue back and forth, who knows what the public believes, but at the end of the day, all of this was inevitable. We've been talking about this long before Trump came into office, long before this government shutdown occurred. And again, I would point out the last time we saw this type of stress in the banking system was late 2019. And we saw what happened in the aftermath of that gave them an excuse to bail out all the banks, to bail out all these institutions, to print 40% of all the dollars in existence in a 2-year period. And they said, well, it wasn't our fault. It was this global pandemic that took place. We had nothing to do with that. So now they'll be saying, well, we had nothing to do with that. It was this government shutdown. If it hadn't been for the shutdown, none of this would have happened. So guys, every day this shutdown goes on, we're going to see problems getting worse, stresses piling up on the banking system to the point where we will see potentially bank runs. And again, we've talked about in the past about what to do in this instance. You need to be as resilient as possible, have a deep pantry. Again, make sure that you don't have more than the FDIC insured limit and deposit it into a bank. If you're under that, I feel that you will get paid that cash back because they will simply print it if they have to. But it doesn't mean that you'll have easy access to that. So make sure you are diversified. That's what the Bible teaches. Be diversified, be resilient in case we have to go through this. Because again, if we have a bank holiday, that means the grocery stores and restaurants will temporarily run out of food, so you want to have a deep pantry. That's how you can best prepare for this. Eventually, I believe this will be fixed, and again, it will be fixed by the new system, unfortunately, that they put us into on the other side of this. Are we about to see this? I don't know. That remains to be seen. But again, if right now, I think on Polymarket and some of these other betting markets where they bet on what is the likely outcome of an event, they've got the end of November as the end of this government shutdown. And if we go to the end of November, we're probably going to see major problems. And I would think that they would probably end this government shutdown once the markets start crashing and it becomes clear that somebody's going to get blamed for it politically. They'll probably make a deal very quickly at that point, but it'll be too late. So unless there's some deal that comes through very quickly, and again, I'm recording this, it's Tuesday night, because I've got to run some errands in the morning. So maybe this video comes out and there's a government deal and we avoid all of this. But we're getting to a point where it won't matter, right? We're getting to a point where it's too little too late if that's the approach that they take. So make sure that you prepare yourself as best as you can. Again, every Friday, fill up your gas tank. Make sure you have a deep pantry, and we'll see how all of this unfolds. In the meantime, leave your comments below. If you can join us later tonight at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time at the live Q&A with Britt and Jenny for the month of November. Hope to see you there. Again, in the meantime, leave your comments below. Let me know what you think. And God willing, I'll see you on Friday. Bye.